Welcome back. I hope you had a chance to recharge as we have more exciting content to cover this afternoon. All the content from today will be available to view on demand within 24 to 48 hours, so don't worry if you missed something earlier. Now, our next panel is on secure cloud services. The public sector is in the process of one of the biggest digital transformations it's ever seen. With digital transformational change comes security challenges alongside the UK government's cloud first policy, putting organisations under pressure to ensure cloud services are secure, as the report outlines the importance of the matter. However, a recent survey revealed 5% of respondents didn't feel confident they could safely and easily share data. So how does the public sector overcome this worry to unlock value from their data safely and securely, especially in a climate that requires to effectively work collaboratively and continue to provide public services when public safety is a foremost concern? So joining me for this conversation on how secure cloud services underpin cybersecurity, I'm delighted to say we have Jonathan Pownall, Digital Specialist at the National Audit Office, Alex Hilton, Chief Executive of Cloud Industry Forum, and Mark Ryan, Professor in Computer Security at the School Computer Science and lead for the Centre of Security and Privacy at the University of Birmingham. Wow, that's quite a title. Now, don't forget to submit any questions you have for our panellists in the live Q&A function. You'll find that on the right-hand side of your screen, and I'll ask as many as possible. So a very warm welcome to you all, to my panellists. And just before we started, actually, I did confess to Alex and to Jonathan, Mark, that what I know about the cloud, really, I could scribble on a postage stamp and have room for more. So I'm hoping perhaps, Alex, you might start us off and just demystify the cloud a little bit for those of us who aren't as knowledgeable as others in our audience.
Yeah, I'll be happy to, Helen, and thanks very much. Nice to be on this panel and this discussion with you. I think rather than thinking of the panel, sorry, the cloud, the panel, the cloud as a thing, and I think that's your first kind of error, not yours, but one's first error in this, is you kind of have to think of it as more of a mindset and an ethos that we're going to. Now, clearly there is technology behind this in terms of, utilizing servers. We're all very familiar with, the likes of Microsoft, Amazon Web Services, Google. They tend to be the bigger three that it's known around out there. So we've come from, I'm sure you don't need a full cloud definition, but I mean, the principles around it are that utilizing third-party data centers, which is kind of how you want to think about that, brings flexibility, agility, scalability, and those are the kind of the three tenets that I really try to talk about here. It enables organizations to be able to utilize, maybe think of it as hosted services on much more of a pay-as-you-go type of mentality and approach there. So the business model is fundamentally different. The technology behind it is really quite different as well. But actually, to a lot of the users out there who maybe, like you, Helen, who confess to say don't know a lot about it, you shouldn't really see a lot of difference. Okay, but the back end and everything that's going on within the engine is significantly different to it.
Let's bring Jonathan into the conversation. Jonathan, what was the driver behind the National Audit Office's cloud guide?
So thanks for that, Helen. So perhaps I'll just explain for those who may not have come across as the role of the NAO. So we're not part of government. We're the independent public spending watchdog. So I'm really commenting on what we see in government rather than NAO in its own right. So we did a report back in 2016 on protecting information in government, and we described that government had was moving to a more decentralized approach to the cloud. So whereas previously security was highly centralized, and some people may remember the government secure intranet and PSN public services network, this was letting organisations were now having to be in a position where they're more responsible for their own security. So our guide, it was really just a very high level layman's term to demystify what cloud's about, kinds of things that organisations need to think about when they're implementing cloud. So it's definitely not a technical guide for implementers. It's really for the people in an oversight role, just to know the basics and the sorts of questions they should be asking of their own management. So it's freely available on our website, and it's a good read for those who are interested.
How did that fit in, Jonathan, with other available guidance?
So there's loads of good stuff from the Cabinet Office and the National Cyber. So we're certainly not trying to replicate that. It's really just to provide some references to where people can go to find more information, and we just talk about at a very high level how organisations should assess the need for cloud services, sorts of considerations to think about when they're implementing, and then once cloud services are up and running, just the management and optimization of those.
Mark, tell us a bit about your work and your involvement, at the university with cloud services.
Thank you. Yes. Well, I was just thinking, the cloud has just been such a huge enabler for industry as a whole and startups in particular. I mean, just imagine that you have a great business idea like, I don't know, Airbnb or something, and you're a startup and you want to put that into effect. Then before the cloud, you would have to kind of host all that stuff yourself. So you'd have to have a lot of servers on your own premises, and those servers would serve your clients. And then, as Alex said, you lose out on scalability because you have to kind of decide in advance how many servers you're going to have. The cloud just makes that just so much more flexible. Now, my work is concerned with the security of cloud services. And I think the first thing I want to say is that if you compare those two options, self-hosting on your own servers and your own premises versus hosting in a commercial cloud like Amazon Web Services or something like that, they both have positives and negatives as far as security is concerned. Obviously, if you put things in your own warehouse, then you have more control over the security. But on the other hand, if you put things in the public cloud, you're handing over the security to people who may be more able to look after those servers than you are, because they may have more expertise. That is their business to look after that stuff, whereas your business may be something quite different. So I think that's an important point. Often the cloud can actually be more secure because there are professionals looking after the servers. But in another way, it might be considered less secure because you don't personally know the employees who are involved in looking after those servers.
So, Mark, if you use public cloud, then how can you protect your data from insider threats?
Well, that's a very good point, actually. And that's really one of the big concerns that I think people have with public cloud. So just to explain what an insider threat is here, it means that I hand over my data to Amazon Web Services. Other cloud services are available, of course. And then I'm relying on AWS to have vetted employees. Now, they will, of course, do a very good job of that, but there will be mistakes. Some people will be, some rogue people may be employed inadvertently. So there is a risk of that kind of insider threat, the cloud service itself or its employees or subcontractors or whatever, threatening your data. Now, one interesting technology that I'd like to mention here that mitigates that is secure enclaves. So there's a recent rise in hardware-supported enclaves, which are like secure environments within a processor where you can get processing that's done with added security and control of things like cryptographic keys and attestation to a remote party. That means that a remote party can verify what the nature of the computation being done in that server is. And that can go a long way towards allowing the users, in other words, the person who's commissioning this cloud service, the person who's the client of the cloud service provider, to verify that the correct programs are being run, that only those programs can access their data. So I'm referring here to technologies like Intel SGX, which is a secure enclave system, and some cloud providers are now beginning to offer that as part of their cloud offering.
Alex, is the UK public sector inherently more cautious, do you think, to adopt cloud technology?
That's a really good question, Helen. I can give you a very quick answer to that, or one that might go on for a few more seconds. I think the very quick answer. So it's slightly rhetorical, I'm afraid. Sorry. The quick answer is yeah, absolutely. There is more caution around that, but I think you have to also understand the logic around that one. I'd love to get Jonathan's perspective on it as well. I think the reason for the caution is, to a degree, the attitude to risk. Okay, now many services that you're working with in the public sector, clearly have public sensitivity and indeed, political sensitivity in many cases, be they NHS patient records or local government information on us as individuals. maybe security related information with security services and so forth that don't directly impact maybe you or me, but do have an impact on society. So there are certain things in there that have risk associated with that, and as a result, certain public sector bodies will maybe be more cautious and more careful about that approach that is taking. I think with the prevalence of cybercrime and ransomware in particular, those have kind of come to the fore more and more. There was an event that I attended just a couple of weeks ago with Microsoft. They have a big annual kind of technical jamboree where they all come together. Satya Nadella, their CEO, was saying that there was a global forecast that they had worked out, which is 6 trillion, I don't know how many noughts that is, dollars of spend, which is the biggest single spend, is going to go into IT security, cloud security. Okay, so security is a worry, and that's the theme of this discussion. It's certainly something that holds organizations back to a large degree. We conduct research ourselves at the Cloud Industry Forum, and despite the fact that we see decent adoption, 89% adoption of cloud in the public sector, we do still see caution and concern around that. That said, and I think both the panelists have already made the point, that in many cases, an outsourced cloud service, even in a public scenario, is actually in many cases far more secure than many of the old, if you like, legacy environments that people found themselves in.
Jonathan, do you want to follow on from Alex's answer there?
Yes, I can chip in. I can give you a good example of that. So earlier this year, we issued a report called the National Law Enforcement Data Programme. So that's looking at the Home Office has a programme to replace the Police National Computer, the PNC. And this programme's been running for about 5 or 6 years now. It's fair to say it's had its fair share of troubles. But when the programme first started, the security requirements were quite onerous. But over the time of the programme, there did become an acceptance on the part of police that the cloud was maturing. And the latest thinking is that now can be hosted in cloud. So I think yes, and definitely it's been said. I think it's one of the great cloud myths, isn't it, that your on-premises setup is more secure than the cloud setup. That's by no means always
Jonathan,
the case.
Lots of departments are moving to the cloud now. We were talking to guests this morning about that. Is there a risk that for various reasons departments will lift and shift existing systems, if you like, into cloud hosting without addressing any of the issues?
Well, there is, because the Mark made the point a bit earlier that cloud is great for startups, and absolutely it is. But of course, government isn't a startup environment. We have big departments with big legacy systems, and then you're moving from that to a new setup. How's that going to be done? And whereas you can have some big burning platforms, I mean, Police National Computer's one. There's other examples. There's the DWP pension system. They can be rehosted. They can be lifted and shifted. But if all that is doing is taking the existing legacy system and the legacy functionality, and it's putting it in a new hosting, but without any of the other optimizations that enable it to work in a cloud environment, that's not at this stage getting the full benefit of cloud. So it's we hear phrases like retire legacy, but it's a long, hard road. It's not as straightforward as that.
Mark, I would imagine, as a university professor, you must look into some fascinating scenarios. And one I just wanted to ask you is, will we ever have internet-based voting, for example, for electing MPs?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And I think there's a lot of call for that. People want more and more done on computers and therefore done in the cloud. And electronic voting, internet-based voting is obviously a good candidate there. The challenges that are known there are that really you want some way of demonstrating to voters that the correct outcome has been declared. So just imagine that you decide, okay, we're going to use a system, I don't know, like Facebook or something, where you just vote online and then your vote kind of disappears. And then ultimately somebody kind of says, all right, this is the candidate who won in your area. Then you think, well, hang on a sec. I mean, that was organized by a company. Can we trust them to have counted things correctly? And the answer is, well, no, we shouldn't have to trust anybody to have counted things correctly. We'd like that to be verifiable. Now, in the real physical world, the way we can imagine that verification is, well, the one that we actually have with voting, where boxes are sealed with a little tag or whatever, and then they're driven to a counting center, which is typically a local sports hall or something. There are some observers who can see what's going on. It's so hard to replicate that kind of verifiability in electronic mediums, because it's just bits and bytes on a server in a cloud. I mean, how is anyone going to get some visibility of that? Well, there are proposals which me and other colleagues have been part of creating, where you would be able to perform cryptographic verification. It would take a while to kind of explain in more detail what that would be. But for example, one way you might think of it is, I'm going to vote on one platform, say my laptop, and then later I'm going to kind of verify it on a completely different platform of my choice, maybe my mobile phone, maybe my friend's laptop or something like that. And then I can verify it again on yet a third platform. And that way I sort of reduce the chance of some malware on any of my devices having been able to change my vote. And then there are other ways where we can make sure that the servers in the cloud are behaving properly. So I think that was a rather long answer to your question. The shorter answer is, it's a very interesting topic that people like me are working on, but we haven't solved it yet, unfortunately. So I don't think we'll be seeing it anytime very soon, hopefully within a few years, but not within a few months, not by the next general election, unfortunately.
Alex seemed to be busy making notes there. He was either making a shopping list or making notes on that answer. I'm going to go with the making notes on that answer. Did you want to pick up, Alex, before I asked you another question?
Absolutely. So I won't pick up my turkey yet then, Helen, okay? I think it's really interesting, this, and I think it's very interesting what Mark was saying there. I think it goes back to my attitude to risk stuff. Every piece of technology that we deploy and have deployed, and I've been in the IT industry 30 years, is open to compromise in some way. But on the whole, it's been very, very small areas that have really been at risk. I think there are with the advent of the internet 20 years ago plus, and certainly now with cloud services existing as well. I guess the prevalence of these, they're more apparent, more open, and so forth. I mean, the public sector. I should certainly flag this one. Some years ago now, at least a decade ago, went forward with a policy that they described as cloud first. Okay, so in other words, any public sector procurement should have been really taking this cloud first policy. And the reason they were doing that, I believe, fundamentally, was one of price. Okay, now actually, if you're going to buy cloud services on price, ultimately you will not succeed, because there are other factors in there that really come into play and should come into play above and beyond price. And in fact, as I look at my other screen here, I've got a white paper that I'm showing on my screen here, which I'd love to share with you all sometime. But the principle around this is, we look at, well, what are the big benefits that organizations are achieving from using cloud services in the commercial world, non-public sector, of course. I talk about agility, cost saving, scalability. It's exactly the same. Those are the top three. Agility, cost saving, and scalability, but the number one absolutely is cost saving. And that was the principle around this cloud first policy in my view. And I don't think it's really worked. And actually where we are, we talked about legacy technology as well, is a world that we describe as hybrid. So it's this mixed environment of both cloud, and as some organizations move to cloud, but also this legacy, which has held back a lot of organizations as well, because you've got to integrate those old, DWP systems and so on as well. The final point I would make is, I think we get onto these kind of discussions and it sounds like we're all being a bit negative about public sector. I'm really not. I think there's some amazing things that have been done in the public sector space. I applied for a passport not long ago. I updated my driving license. I do my, goodness me, tax return, make a note. So these things are really, really good services that exist, and we all use them, have been for a number of years. So there's some great technology out there that's in use in public sector, but I think we have a long way to go, and I think that attitude has still got to change. And indeed, the skills have got to be in place within public sector organizations to augment that.
Of course, and that boils down to people, which was another theme that came out of this morning. Somebody said the top three priorities for security in the public sector was number one, training, number two, training, number three, training, and that people were sort of at the heart of that. So I was just going to finish off, Alex, with saying, what are the biggest security concerns as far as you believe for the public sector?
Well, I think, as I already mentioned, ransomware. I think the whole cyber piece is massive. Obviously, I talked about the amount of money that Microsoft are expecting to see plowed into this whole security space, and there are many vendors in the market who specialize particularly around security. I think remote working obviously has brought its challenges with us, and again, part of our research we've looked at is more staff have been vulnerable because of technically vulnerable, working, well, obviously mentally vulnerable as well, but working from home. In the environments that we find themselves in, and more than any other, the public sector has been challenged by that because I work in, if you like, in a commercial sector. I run a not-for-profit organisation, but I've been able to work from home for the last few years, so that actually hasn't been a big deal because I've got a laptop and we could be mobile. I can go and work from Starbucks or wherever. If you work in the public sector and you're accessing secure systems, that might be a more difficult thing to do. So many public sector organisations, certainly at scale, have had challenges with that. BYOD, bring your own device, so can you sit at home and use your own laptop? Many didn't have their own technology. You might have an iPad or an Xbox or whatever, but not necessarily technology that's appropriate to work in those environments. So those are more challenging environments that organizations in the public sector have had to face. And I think on the whole, they've done a good job to adapt and move forwards with this quite quickly.
Just keeping my eye on the right-hand side of the screen, we've got a question. Perhaps you could take it, Jonathan. It's coming in from Rose. Rose says, I still use external hard drives to back up files because I don't trust myself with cloud and similar online backups. Is there any issue with staying old school instead of going completely online? That's a good question, I think, from Rose.
Well, it's interesting because ransomware has been mentioned, and I think there's been well-publicised examples of organisations that have been breached, and when they've discovered the breach, they've found that they've got to the backups and they've gone as well. But I think that I was at a conference earlier this week and somebody asked a similar question, and what counts as online and offline. And I think in this modern world, the definition of something that's offline would be something that an attacker couldn't get to if they get into your network. So it doesn't necessarily have to be something that's physical, but obviously for each organisation, they must assess their own needs and their own requirements. And I think, as Alex said earlier,
on that as well, Helen?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Jonathan,
Alex. Carry on.
I was wondering if I could just make a quick point on that one as well. I mean, my view is absolutely, the cloud is going to be safe and secure for that, because you know what, Microsoft, Dropbox, all the organizations who do these kinds of services, and there's many of them out there, that's their living. That's what they do. I have a number of, I have them sitting behind my desk here, a number of hard disks, which I used to store, I know, family photos, whatever on. They're vulnerable. They're vulnerable. If something goes wrong in my house, heaven forbid, the house burns down or there's a fire or those disks become corrupt, I've lost all that information, whereas they're stored in the cloud, and Microsoft and the likes are backing them up themselves. So absolutely it's secure using the cloud services for that kind of thing completely. And if that's, personal data or professional data, absolutely they're going to be much more secure than they are storing them on hard disk devices or organizations backing up to tape and taking those outside of the premises each day.
Mark, do you want to add to that before we carry on?
Yeah, I mean, I totally take the points mentioned, especially the one about off-site backup that Alex said. If you just back up things locally, then you're not resistant to your house burning down or whatever. But I just wanted to also mention what Jonathan said, namely that if you get a ransomware attack, which is an attack in which the attacker has managed to encrypt your files and now you can't access your files unless you pay some ransom, then there is the question of whether that's going to affect your backups as well. And I'm not aware of anything within Dropbox or Microsoft Backup or any of these other cloud-based services which would necessarily prevent that. I mean, they may try to do some detection, because I could imagine that they're going to say, well, if suddenly we find that you've got all your files have changed, in one go, and you're kind of uploading a whole load of new files, the encrypted versions, then we some sort of detection mechanism could question whether that is a ransomware attack. I don't know if they have implemented that. It doesn't sound that easy to implement. It doesn't sound like it's going to be terribly reliable. So I don't think that cloud services do resist ransomware attacks on backups. Does anybody have any contrary information to educate me?
No, I mean, I can't really add to that, Mark. And, you know, from a technology perspective, I'm sure these things are moving at such an incredible pace. So I'm sure if it's not an area that's been addressed, it will be an area that's going to be addressed. I guess my point ultimately was, you know, this is the core business of these organizations, be it bigger or indeed smaller ones as well. So, you know, it's in their best interest to ensure that the billions of dollars that they plow into research it is going to be back to Rose's original question on the chat there, is going to ensure that she's going to have a more robust and reliable experience, you know, backing up her services, be they personal ones or professional.
I mean, I agree with
ones.
that point.
Of course, there's risk. Yeah.
And that echoes with what I said earlier, namely that you're in a good position if you hand over this kind of security thing to professionals who know what they're doing in this space.
Yeah.
I think it is a good point that that cloud services could try to detect in the way that I said, so that they would resist ransomware attacks on their backups.
And should public cloud services insist on, now a KYC, I'm going to be honest with you, Mark, I don't know what KYC is. And this was a question that I took from some literature that you sent me in order to combat crime. So it's better to be honest, isn't it?
Well, KYC means know your customer. So KYC is a very common term in the financial industry, where banks and other financial organizations are expected to know who their customer is. And the purpose of that is to combat crime and money laundering and other such things. Now, because the cloud can be used to commit various kinds of crime, I mean, take ransomware as a possible example, then there is this question of whether the cloud providers should be required to know who their customer is, you know, and not necessarily allow all services to be available to kind of random people who might be planning to abuse those services.
It's difficult though, isn't it? The cloud services, so many people. I mean, we heard very eloquently this morning from the leader of Redcar and Cleveland Council on an extraordinary ransomware attack that the council was subject to, and the devastation and damage and cost was extraordinary. And it's very difficult for them, I guess, to know their customers too, not suggesting it was anybody in their community that did it. In fact, I think the attack was from abroad. But it's very tricky, isn't it, to know your customer, and for many people, because there are so many of them.
It is tricky. And one of the things that I find interesting in this space is that, you know, more and more we are asked to kind of upload personal details online. And this KYC is just yet another opportunity for companies to insist that we upload our driving license and passport and date of birth and all this kind of other stuff. And I find that quite objectionable. So one of the research areas that I'm involved in is how you could do KYC, know your customer, in a more privacy supporting way, how you could still get the benefits. So the ability to trace transactions and to figure out who has done what, and ultimately to bring people to account if they've committed crimes, but in such a way that most people who are innocent would not have their privacy invaded all the time, and would not have personal details about them proliferated across a whole bunch of cloud provider services.
Jonathan, what exactly is vendor lock-in, and should we be?
So, well, yes, the Cabinet Office have recognised this as a consideration. So obviously the market is concentrating. There are 3 major providers now of cloud services, and I think they're just keeping an eye on the situation. Of course, the market is what it is. How government deals with that's really a matter for policy. It's not one for us. But what we suggest in the cloud guide is it's useful just to think about an exit strategy. So under what circumstances might you want to change from one cloud provider to another? What would prompt you to do it? How long would it take you to do that? What sorts of considerations would be involved? Even if you never use it, it's probably a very useful exercise to go through.
Alex, I'd like to just end with you, if I may, on 2 stats. I was reading a report by UK Cloud on the state of digital and data. The stats that I thought were really interesting was that 43% of people asked aren't confident their data is being stored appropriately for its security classification. That's 43% not confident, and 48% suggest that concerns around compliance and security risks are hindering their use of digital technologies to derive the best value from data. How can we, it's a big question to end on, no pressure, how can we improve those stats? I found those quite shocking, actually. I thought they were very high percentages.
Yeah, and I think there is an inherent mistrust to a degree of things that we can't see and touch sometimes, and I think that often comes back to really the kind of the crux of this discussion. You know, in the big scheme of things, this is all relatively new technology, but it is something we're very familiar with. And people talk about artificial intelligence and think of, you know, Terminator movies and it's taken over the world. We've been using that for years. You know, this is not actually that new. Do you have an Alexa in your house? We could probably shout now, Helen, and see if Alexa comes on in your house. But
I
the
don't
principle
have
around...
an Alexa in my house, actually. I don't. I resist that.
All right. Okay. Well done. But there'll be other things. You have Siri on your mobile phone or whatever your phone of choice. You know, so these things do exist, and we're getting very familiar with them in our day-to-day consumer lives. Often, what happens is our commercial lives might lag behind, and in fact, in many cases, you will see that people are using technology in their personal lives, which is more advanced than the technology they use in their business lives, which is a bit of a worry. So I think absolutely there is concern, and as I said, security definitely is the first and the foremost thing that organizations need to take off. I didn't see the red car presentation this morning. It sounded really interesting. What would be interesting in that discussion would be, what have they done as a result of that ransomware attack? How are they managing their environment? What are the lessons that have been learned from that? And what are the lessons, I'm sure they did this, can they pass on to the audience so that we can all learn from that and ensure that they're building on a secure platform? Security, as my final point, has got to be built in as the core component of any piece of infrastructure. It can't come in late on. It's got to be right at the start. What are you doing from a security perspective? And that will certainly help address some of these issues.
Yeah, you're right. I think Mary touched on a little bit about the recovery, but it would have been nice that she had more time. Perhaps she'll guest again. I thought she was fascinating and interesting as well, that we commented just after she'd finished that Mary's of that generation, without being disrespectful in any way, that she's not a digital native, if you like. And I thought it was absolutely extraordinary listening to the steep learning curve that her and the council had been on to tackle such a massive attack. I found her words really inspiring, actually, and an interesting thread for that panel. But this panel's been out of time, unfortunately, but I would like to say a very big thank you to Jonathan, Alex and Mark. Great discussion to come back to, and I do feel that gradually through doing these I'm learning more about the cloud and getting more confidence with it in my personal life, as well as you talking about public sector cloud. So thank you for joining me very, very much indeed. It's encouraging to see just how much work is going on into migrating to and securing the cloud and how much has already been done.